Yes or no to this statement: science refutes God. Some say that modern science demolishes religion's core beliefs. Others say that only faith can reveal truths such as why we are here that science just can't touch. I'm John Donvan, moderator for the Intelligence Squared U.S. debates. Does science refute God? Only one side wins. Funding for Intelligence Squared U.S. is provided by the George L. Orstrom Jr. Foundation, Profit Capital, Paul E. Singer, the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, and others. A complete list is available from PBS. Yes or no to this statement: science refutes God? A debate from Intelligence Squared U.S. I'm John Donvan. We have four superbly qualified debaters who will be arguing for and against that motion: science refutes God. Our debate goes in 3 rounds, and then the audience votes to choose a winner, and only one side wins. On the side arguing for the motion, science refutes God, Lawrence Krauss, a theoretical physicist and director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University. His partner is Michael Shermer. He is a founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine and a columnist for Scientific American. On the side arguing against the motion that science refutes God, Dinesh D'Souza. He is the best-selling author of What's So Great About Christianity and director of the documentary 2012, Obama's America. And his partner is Ian Hutchinson. Ian Hutchinson is the professor of nuclear science and engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So we would like to register the preliminary vote. If you go to the keypads at your seat, if you agree with the motion at this point, science refutes God, we want you to push number 1. If you disagree, push number 2. And if you're undecided or agnostic, push number 3. When you vote the second time, we'll compare the 2 numbers, and again, the team whose numbers have moved by the highest percentage will be declared our winner. So on to round 1, opening statements from each debater in turn. Our motion is science refutes God, and here to debate first, in support of this motion, Lawrence Krauss. He is the director of the Origins Project and professor of physics at the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University. He is also the author of the best-selling book, A Universe from Nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, Lawrence Krauss.
Thank you. I first want to begin by clarifying the nature of the motion, because the motion isn't science disproves God, it's science refutes God. And that's very important because you can't disprove a notion that's basically vague and unfalsifiable. But we can ask, is it rational to expect that that's likely? And tonight I want to emphasize that 500 years of science have demonstrated that God, that vague notion, is not likely. It's irrational to believe in God. Now, to refute God means refuting several claims. 1, that God is necessary. 2, that there is evidence for God. And 3, that that belief is rational. And the point is that the progress of science has shown over and over and over again that the answers to all those 3 questions are no, 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 no. Now, my own scientific field is cosmology, and that's the study of the origin and evolution of the universe as a whole. And it's where science and religion sort of confront each other. And creation myths have abounded throughout human history, and science confronts those creation myths. But I want to point out that our opponents, I'm pretty sure, are going to argue first that one aspect of science that supports perhaps the belief in God is this notion that the universe is apparently fine-tuned for life. That is a remarkable and, in fact, cosmic misunderstanding, because it's the same kind of misunderstanding that led people to believe in special creation for life on Earth before Darwin. It looked like everything was designed for the environment in which it lived. But what Darwin showed us was that a simple proposition, namely that there's genetic variation among a population combined with natural selection, meant that you didn't need supernatural shenanigans. That in fact, all the diversity of life on Earth could arise from a single life form by natural law. I want to point out that in fact, the universe isn't particularly fine-tuned or conducive to life. Most of the universe is rather inhospitable to life. And in fact, perhaps the biggest fine-tuning problem in my own field of cosmology, something I'm in fact very proud to have proposed in a sense, is that the energy of empty space is not zero. The weirdest thing you can imagine, that empty space weighs something. But remarkably, the energy of empty space is 120 orders of magnitude smaller than we would naively predict. If the energy of empty space was zero, which is by far a more natural value, the universe would be a better place for life to live. We all thought it was zero when I was a graduate student because that was a natural value. If it was zero, the universe would be a better place. In fact, you can show the value that it has now makes the universe the worst of all possible universes to live in for the future of life. So much for a universe created for us. Now, once Darwin had removed the apparent need for God in evolution of life, the last bastion for God was the creation of the universe. How you can get something from nothing. And what we're in a remarkable situation of being in is precisely the same situation that Darwin existed in 150 years ago. Namely, we have a plausible explanation of how a universe could precisely come from nothing. There do remain deep philosophical and scientific questions that are unanswered, but God is not required or useful to explain any of them. And therefore, to conclude, science has taught us that we don't need God to create a universe, that there's no evidence for God, that the specific scientific claims of those who require God disagree with empirical evidence, and it's irrational. Science refutes God, so clearly you should vote for our side. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence Krauss. And that is our motion, Science Refutes God. And here to speak against the motion, Ian Hutchinson. He is a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT and the author of Monopolizing Knowledge, A Scientist Refutes Religion-Denying, Reason-Destroying Scientism.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you tonight and to explain why science does not refute God. Let's agree that this motion is not about whether, for example, the latest sociological theories disprove the gods and goddesses of ancient Greek mythology. No, it's about whether modern natural science, exemplified by things like physics, chemistry, biology, geology, and so on, rule out thoughtful theism. The God I'm going to discuss is the God of Christianity, because I'm a follower of Jesus. But my side's job is not to convince you of the truth of Christianity, although I think it is true. Our job is just to show that Christianity's God is not refuted by science. To establish the motion, what our opponents have to do is to show that some central tenet of what Christians believe about God is impossible, or at least highly implausible, in the light of science. And that's a tall order. Actually, they can't even come close. But let me dispense with a couple of the most plausible sounding arguments. I'll illustrate one common argument from the writing of an MIT colleague, Alan Lightman, who wrote in Salon magazine last year. He said, "The central doctrine of science is the view that the laws of nature are inviolable." He said, "Science and God are compatible as long as the latter, God, is content to stand on the sidelines once the universe has begun." So the question is, how do I answer Alan Lightman? It's straightforward. The presumption that the laws of nature are inviolable is just not a doctrine of science. Alan and a lot of other people are just wrong about that. Great scientists like those that were recited before, Newton, Boyle, Dalton, Faraday, Maxwell, were Christian believers who saw their science as compatible with a God who is active in the world and on occasions works miracles that go beyond the laws that they were discovering. God is mostly not a scientific question, and so the evidence for God is mostly not scientific. If you insist that scientific evidence is the only type you will count, then you put out of business not just religion, but a vast range of other human knowledge, like history or the law or politics or philosophy or literature. There's no scientific way to prove that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. There's no scientific way to judge the justice of a verdict. There isn't even a scientific way to detect a true thought. But all of these things are real, cognitive questions whose answers are important and often indisputable. And questions about God are usually of the same type, not scientific. If science in its endeavors fails to detect God, so what? Thoughtful Christians don't believe that God is a natural phenomenon or a law of nature to be established by scientific investigation. Science, for all of its power, is utterly incompetent to refute God.
Thank you, Ian Hutchinson. We are halfway through the opening round of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. I'm John Donvan. You have heard two of the speakers so far, and now on to the third. Science refutes God, and here to speak in support of the motion, Michael Shermer. He is the founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine, executive director of the Skeptic Society, a monthly columnist for Scientific American, and the author of The Believing Brain. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Shermer.
Thank you. Thank you. Gods are invisible agents who run the world, who control things, who create these patterns, who are these patterns that we use to explain things. All cultures everywhere in the world have created God beliefs. But for tonight, I want to ask, what's more likely? That our opponents here happen to pick the right God and the right religion among all the about 10,000 different religions and about 1,000 different gods that humans have constructed socially, anthropologically, psychologically in the last 10,000 years. 10,000 different religions, 1,000 different gods. Our opponents agree with us that 999 of those gods are false gods. They are atheists like we are atheists. What I'm asking you to do is just go one God further with us. So here's what happened. About 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, these small bands of hunter-gatherers began to coalesce into chiefdoms and states. As long as the numbers are small, informal means of behavior control and moral enforcement operate quite well. As soon as the numbers are too large for these informal means, shunning, making people feel guilty, gossiping about them, making them feel embarrassed for their bad behavior, as soon as the populations are big, there's too much opportunity for free riding and for cheating the system and taking advantage of it and getting away with it. So two institutions evolved. Government, to set up a set of rules and everybody gets a copy, and religion, in case you think you got away with it, you didn't, because there's an eye in the sky that knows all and sees all and keeps track of this. So this is the second part of how humans construct religions and gods, because we need it for moral enforcement. It just so happens, by contingency and chance, religion and government was the first on the scene. Now, what's happened in the last several centuries since the Enlightenment, in addition to the trajectory that Professor Krauss outlined for you, science displacing religion as the primary means of explaining how the world works, something else has also happened. We've slowly but ineluctably replaced religion as the primary source of our morals and came up with the clever idea that you actually have to have a reason why you have certain moral principles, and we're going to write certain laws. And that has been the trajectory of the Enlightenment since about 200 years ago. And so again, what's more likely, that one of them happens to be the one true religion and the one true God, and all those others that have been constructed are false gods, or that, as we can clearly see, anthropologically, socially, psychologically, and so on, this is what people do to get along. Northern European countries do just fine with much lower rates of religiosity than we have. It is possible to do that, and that is what we've been doing. They are monotheists. They believe that there's just one God, and that Jesus is God manifest on earth, and he is your Savior, and you accept him. For redeeming us for sins we never committed. Somebody else in the past committed them. So, as I understand this, God sacrifices himself to save us from himself. If that sounds as incomprehensible to you as it does to me, I urge you to vote for our side. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Shermer. And our motion is Science Refutes God. And now our final debater speaking against this motion, Dinesh D'Souza. He is the best-selling author of many books, including What's So Great About Christianity. He is also the director of the documentary 2016, Obama's America, and a former policy analyst in the Reagan White House. Ladies and gentlemen, Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. Here we are as human beings, we're thrown into the world. And we can't help, if we're curious, if we're thoughtful, to say, first of all, why is there a universe? Second, what's our purpose? What are we doing here? Third, what's going to come after? We're going to die, but what next? Now I ask you, what are the scientific answers to those questions? And in fact, the answers are, from science, don't have a clue, don't have a clue, and don't have a clue. Why? Because none of those questions is amenable to being decided empirically. Science can show how we got a universe, but not why. On the question of what our purpose is here, science is completely silent. Moral issues are in a way outside the province of science. Why? Because science deals with what is, and morality is what ought to be. And finally, on the question of what comes after death, what possible empirical evidence can science provide on either side of that question? So because science is in no position to refute God, what we get from the other side is pop psychology. And we've been getting pop psychology from atheists for several hundred years. It's an effort to explain why people believe instead of providing any kind of a real refutation. You remember a few decades ago, Freud basically said that God and religion could be dismissed as wishful thinking. We wish for a better world, and so we make one up. Well, that would kind of explain heaven, which satisfies wishful thinking, but it really wouldn't explain why major religions have invented hell. Who would wish for that? The genesis of a belief, how you came to it, has nothing to do with whether or not that belief can be sustained as a matter of argument. The reality is, and we keep hearing a lot about Darwin, because the last good argument against God came out in the 1850s. Science has made a whole bunch of discoveries since then, but they point in the opposite direction. And therefore, what you find very often from atheists is now highly complicated defensive maneuvers to account for things that atheists resisted all the way. When the discovery of the Big Bang came, this, by the way, was at a time when most scientists believed the universe was eternal. The steady state universe was the prevailing doctrine of American and Western science. So it came as a shock that the universe had a beginning. Why? Because in a way, it wasn't just that matter had a beginning, but space and time also had a beginning. In other words, this was something that the ancient Hebrews had said thousands of years ago, and without conducting a single scientific experiment. The ancient Hebrews said, no, first there was nothing, and then there was a universe. By the way, that's almost identical to what Lawrence Krauss said. First there was nothing, no particles, no energy, no laws, and then there was a universe. Completely consistent with what Christians believe. And the astounding fact is that 2,000 years later, modern science, after climbing round and round the mountain, has arrived at the top only to find a bunch of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. We are living at a time when religious believers do not need to be afraid of science. They should, as I do, embrace science and welcome science, because correctly understood, far from pointing away from God, science thrillingly points to God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh D'Souza. And that concludes round one of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate, where the motion is Science Refutes God. Now we go on to round two. We're going to take questions from you and from me, but I want to start by actually getting to something I'm very curious about, and that's the issue of miracles. I want to put to the side, and you in particular, Ian Hutchinson, who is arguing against the notion that science refutes God. What is a miracle if not a violation of the laws of physics? And is that what it is, in addition to all of its other implications? Does it not violate the laws of physics? And if it does so, how is that even possible, and how does that fit into this argument?
So what we call the laws of physics, from a Christian point of view, are the way that God normally orders the universe. It's the normal behavior of things round about us. And Boyle, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society, wrote a whole book about what nature is. And what he advocated was that what we mean, or should mean, by nature is the normal course of events. Now, of course, miracles are not the normal course of events. And by the way, it didn't take science to tell us that. You know, people in the first century knew that people don't rise from the dead when they've been hung on crosses, and people knew that women don't bear children unless, well, you know what. You know, this is not something that modern science has been necessary to tell us. So yes, miracles are abnormal events, usually abnormal events.
Why does science not refute those things? As in,
It's simply not the case that you have to presume that the laws of nature are universally inviolable. It's simply not necessary to do science to do that.
Lawrence Krauss.
Well, that's ridiculous. In fact, it's ridiculous to the science that you do. When you do science, you're presuming that the results of an experiment in your laboratory apply in another laboratory. The fundamental claim that if you just miracles in your particular religion, it's kind of remarkable that these violations of the laws of nature only occurred before video cameras and intelligence squared and the internet, and that you have these remarkable violations of the laws of nature in a book which I was really surprised to hear Dinesh call a scientific document, the Bible. I hope he really didn't mean that. St. Augustine would be very upset with you because he said the Bible wasn't scientific. But these violations of the laws of nature only occurred at a time when there was no evidence for them.
But Lawrence,
and you believe it.
Lawrence, but is there a logical argument that you can make against miracles? Not the "I didn't see them and nobody has seen them lately" argument, but is there a logical argument you can make against them?
Our logic is determined by nature, not by what we'd like. And nature has told us that miracles don't happen. That's it. It's not what I want or what I think should be rational. It's do they happen? And there's no evidence that they've ever happened.
The Big Bang, the creation of the universe, was a miracle. Why was it a miracle? Because it used no known law of nature. It was, in a sense, supernatural. The universe is all...
But that's just because you didn't understand it.
But no, but you haven't... See, here's the thing. When we talk about experiments and reproducible things, you're talking, for example, let's take, for example, are there beings on other planets? Right? It's an empirical question. In
principle, it's an empirical question, yeah.
Empirical question. Right now, there is no evidence that there are creatures in outer space.
Yes.
Therefore, have you refuted that belief?
No, but it's not an illogical one, like the notion that
you haven't refuted it because you haven't refuted it because you haven't produced.
It doesn't require me to suspend the laws of physics in order to believe it.
But if I were to believe in creatures in outer space, I wouldn't be irrational, would I?
No, but you've got to respond to the point he just made. It does not require a suspension of the laws of physics in order for you to believe there are creatures in outer space.
Right, and I would say it doesn't require.
But miracles do.
No, miracles simply say that the laws of physics are incomplete, that the laws of physics are generalizations that reflect the limits of human knowledge. These aren't nature's laws, they're Newton's laws, and it took an Einstein to modify them.
So when the sun stood, so these biblical scientists who thought that the sun went around the earth, because that's what they thought when they were writing, when the sun stopped in the sky, of course, had the sun been going around the earth, that would be fine, but we now know that actually the earth goes around the sun, and the fact that the sun moves in the sky is the fact that the earth rotates. So had the sun stopped in the sky, the stopping of the rotation of the earth would have produced forces which would have destroyed all life on the planet. But that somehow doesn't violate the basic classical physics, and every now and then that's possible.
Well, who are these biblical scientists you're
Well,
talking about?
you know, the horn blowing, the sun
the
stopping.
people
you know,
who thought that the earth was the center of the universe and the sun went around it were Christians who, like non-Christians, were taught by scientists. That's where they got the idea. They weren't biblical scientists.
weren't
They
taught
got it
by-
from you guys.
I think what
But
I
look,
think
but look, let me-
wait, Ian, I think I hear a serious question. I didn't mean it that way. I didn't mean it that way. I think I hear an interesting challenge. In that Lawrence is saying that if a miracle were to occur, that it has ripple effects in a broad. It doesn't just affect the people who are witnessing the miracle, but if for example, if the earth stopped because the trumpets are blowing, on the other side of the earth, you know, some tribe doesn't know what's going on, but suddenly the earth has stopped for them too. How do they explain that?
In the 18th century, as science really got going, people thought that there were deterministic laws of physics, and that once you understood the initial conditions, you could solve those laws, and the result was absolutely determined. I think Lawrence will agree that what science has found out in the 20th century is that that is simply not true, that there is in the universe as a whole, as we discover it by science, some deep uncertainties, some undefined behavior, which in the end cannot be considered to be deterministic. In other words, a deterministic universe in which there's no room for God to operate is simply not the way we think about the universe as physicists these days.
Michael Shermer.
Let's say, Ian, that petitionary prayer actually works. Again, as a physicist,
Petitionary prayer, you mean, I would like something to happen,
petitioning
and you pray
to
for
the
it.
deity to say cure my cancer or whatever. And it happens. Wouldn't you be curious to know how the deity, or whatever it is, reaches into the world, stirs the particles, reconfigures the DNA so the cancer cells quit replicating so rapidly and so on? And the moment you figured that out as a scientist, it would no longer be a miracle, it wouldn't be supernatural, it would just be part of nature. It's like, so if I recant this prayer 6 times between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m., this is the effect. It's a measurable, determined thing. That's just now incorporated as part of science.
Well, let's be clear that it's never been a religious position that if we have a natural explanation for something, that means that God is absent or that God didn't do it. It's always been a biblical viewpoint that even on things which we know are part of nature, God can be considered to be active in those things. So while this discussion of miracles is interesting in itself, one shouldn't be misled into thinking that the only place that God can act in the world is through those things which are so extraordinary that they seem
John,
to
I just want to
be
correct
Lawrence
an
Krauss,
error
and
that,
I'll come back
I mean, I don't think you meant it, Ian,
Lawrence
so
Krauss.
I want to just make it clear. The laws of physics are deterministic. The Schrodinger equation, which is the basis of quantum mechanics, is a second-order differential equation, and therefore the laws are deterministic. Our observations aren't deterministic, but the underlying laws are deterministic. Nothing's changed in 400 years, and so it's really important to recognize there's no way
the universe isn't deterministic.
Wait a minute.
It's governed by quantum mechanics.
Just one thing, because we got into 4 syllables and I'm not that smart. Just give us a working definition of the word deterministic. You mean
you start with an initial condition for the equations of quantum mechanics, and the evolution of the system is determined unambiguously.
It has
with
to
no
happen.
uncertainty. Your measurement of the system has uncertainty, but the evolution of the underlying system is completely determined.
I'll accept the slight correction but the point nevertheless remains exactly the way I said it, which is that the universe is not deterministic. What science does is try to explain the universe by deterministic laws, by looking at the world and trying to say, how is it completely reproducible and in accordance with these universal laws? And what it finds out is that no matter how hard we try, we're actually unable to have a complete description of the universe of that type. And this was such a shock that even as great a scientist as Albert Einstein was repelled by it. And that's why he said, God doesn't play dice with the world, because he just could not abide it.
Is it your position that there are certain things that science can know, and then there are certain things that science can't know, therefore doesn't refute God? But what is in this world? Dinesh, you talked a little bit about this universe of things that science can't handle, explain, such as why we are here. How large is that category of things that we can't know, and is science just irrelevant to that category of knowledge?
There are some questions in which Christians and religious believers are making factual claims. God made the universe. It's a factual claim. Either he did or he didn't. There is life after death. We may have no way to find out, but that's a factual claim. Either there is or there isn't. The resurrection happened. Either it did or it didn't. Now, religion also makes moral claims. This is how you should live. This is a happy life, and so on. So religion operates in two domains. The second domain is untouchable by science. Science can try to give accounts of how morality originated, but that's not the same thing as what you should and shouldn't do.
Well, but just be more clear about that distinction, because I want to go straight to the other side about that.
Well, science can say that we evolved a desire for cooperation out of Darwinian evolution, but that doesn't say if there's a famine in Haiti if I should give money or no. So in other words, the content of morality is unaffected by science, although science can give an account of the origin of morality.
But not the what is actually right or wrong. So
Yeah, and the other thing
let me before you move on, let me go to Michael Shermer on that.
Well, so where do we get our morals from? It can't be from the Bible, because almost nobody obeys, certainly not the Old Testament, and most of the New Testament. I mean, death penalty for adultery, there goes half of Congress. I mean, nobody is going to do this, right? So we pick and choose, we cherry pick from the holy books based on something else that's happened that I referenced in my opening statement of there's been this other change that's happened, this secularization of morality. That is, you have to actually have good reasons for why you hold certain moral principles, and you should be able to articulate them. And so that's been the change there. So even if you and I both listen to the still small voice within to decide what's right or wrong, Dinesh, I'm claiming you're not getting it from the Bible, and I'm not either. We're getting it from somewhere else. I think we've evolved this propensity to have moral emotions, and then culture tweaks them, and we've been getting progressively more moral.
But what's telling us what is actually right or wrong?
But I think science does tell us what's right and wrong.
Sorry, Lawrence Krauss.
I think science does tell us what's right and wrong in a real way.
Really?
We have learned, for example, the scientific facts that certain animals can suffer, for example, affects our decision of how we should treat those animals, whether we should eat them or not eat them, or the scientific evidence that certain people of certain colors don't have different intellects, different capabilities, has changed the way we deal with other humans.
But at bottom,
science has determined the way we behave in the modern world.
And science is telling us what's right or wrong.
Yeah, I think so, because
Wrong.
it's telling us how the world actually works.
Ian Hutchinson.
I don't think it's the case that it tells us right or wrong. I think science does often inform us in ways that help us to implement our morals and our ethics more effectively, more fairly, more accurately, and more truly. But in the end, it cannot tell us whether it's right or wrong to do something, because categories of right and wrong aren't scientific categories.
Well, the Bible certainly doesn't tell us either.
Well,
First of all, we don't get, none of us, morality from the Bible. It's not like I read the 10 Commandments and went, oh, stealing is wrong. Wow, didn't know that before. Killing is wrong. Incredible.
Exactly.
I already knew that.
Okay.
How did I know it? I knew it because of what Adam Smith calls the impartial spectator, the voice of conscience. So it is the contention of religious believers that the voice of conscience has been implanted in us by God. Now, you say it's come from evolution, and we say it could have been implanted in us by God through evolution. Now, just to say that science tells us facts doesn't mean that science changes our morality. If I were to step on the stage and stomp on a dog, there'd be a universal wave of revulsion in the audience, although presumably the matter would be more controversial if it were a cat. But science, my point is science can tell us the dog feels pain. But the idea that we shouldn't cause pain to others, that's a moral proposition. Science is merely altering the fact which puts that moral principle into motion. So we have widened our circles of morality based upon new facts, and science can provide those. But science isn't actually telling us what's right or wrong at all.
I want to go in a moment to you in the audience to take questions. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, arguing it out over this motion, Science Refutes God. To the team that is arguing for the motion that science refutes God, I want to ask you it's somewhat of a personal question. Can a scientist believe in God and still be a functioning scientist?
Absolutely. There are functioning scientists and who can believe in God. People are not fully rational. The point is that
No, I'm
people can
asking,
believe...
the question is, can
people-
you be a good scientist and believe in God?
As long
or-
as you don't
or-
take the God into the laboratory. As a very famous biologist said, when I go into the laboratory, I become an atheist, because when I twiddle the knobs in my experiment, I don't believe there's some angel affecting the results of the experiment. And if I believe that in the laboratory, why should I believe it outside? Some people choose to believe it outside. The minute they take it into the laboratory, they stop being good scientists.
But that's
Ian Hutchinson.
actually quite contrary to history. I mean, what got modern science going in the first place was a belief in the faithfulness of God, of a creator who'd made a rational creation. And a good case can be made that the reason why science as we know it, modern science, grew up in the West was in part because Christianity, in its philosophical and theological viewpoints, including the belief in God and in God's faithfulness, served as a kind of hospitable environment in which that science could grow up. So it's actually not the case that the scientists of history had to say to themselves, I'm going to become an atheist when I go into the lab. Many of them went into the lab precisely because they were not atheists.
But I get the sense, though, that the other side is arguing that as science progressed, as the years went by, the more that science developed and the more that scientists knew, the more tempting atheism became for them because of the volume and because of the discoveries and because they found inconsistencies. What about that? Do you want to take that, Dinesh, to Susan?
Well,
They knew too much after a while.
I think there's a presumption that science explains the material world, and science does it with material explanations.
Do you agree with that? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Physical causes have physical...
Okay.
Exactly.
Go on, Dinesh.
So it is a presumption of modern science, not a proof, but a presumption that beyond the material world, there is nothing. So take, for example, the fact that as humans, we experience consciousness. We know that there's something in us, consciousness, that can't be reduced simply to materialism.
How do you know that?
Hold on a second. No, hold on a second. When you say, how do you know that, you're presuming that it is. Do you agree that the cause of consciousness is not known?
The fact that something is not known does not imply it's God. You better not get
Right,
that
but
out of
neither...
it.
So consciousness is an immaterial thing that may have a material explanation, and the key word is may. And yet you as a scientist believe it does.
I don't believe anything. I just want to
You just said
learn
that
how
all
the world
causes are
works.
material.
I'll wait for the experiments and the theory.
Ah,
Okay.
so in other words, you're presuming...
Watch out.
Well, I'm simply
I'm ready.
saying, as a scientist, you are closed off to the possibility of non-material explanations, true or false?
No, I told you, if the
You're open to
stars
them?
moved around today, I'd be really thinking there's some intelligence in the universe. There's just never been such an observation.
So-
And until
so-
there is, I'll assume the reasonable, logical thing, since there's never been such an observation, there's unlikely to be one. That's all. As a scientist, I can say what's likely and what's unlikely. I don't believe anything. I can say, is this likely or unlikely? That's all.
Dinesh.
I think this is very important because throughout your book, this is called A Universe
you
from
hold it
Nothing.
up? And-
I have it right here. I recommend
the name
it.
of your book,
It's a
Lawrence?
it's a very useful primer on the limits of science. Here's why.
Absolutely, the
So
universe.
to quote a sample line, and there are many like this, you say getting something from nothing, and then you say, this is how our universe could have arisen. And then you say, I stress the word could here because we may never have enough empirical information. Next page you say, these are useful operational efforts to describe how a universe might actually have originated. Here's my point. You're invoking coulds and mights and maybes to provide a refutation. Now, even if you were successful in saying that I have an alternative possibility to God, you haven't refuted God. You've simply given an alternative possibility. So you have all these qualifications in the book, but then when you step up here, you act as if science has demonstrated that the universe did in fact come from nothing, whereas you say it never did. You have not made that demonstration, and you
think
admit
that
it.
when I was up there, I said it was plausible. And plausible
Lawrence,
is
please.
remarkable because everything you've talked about in terms of religion is implausible. So the point is that just like with evolution, a simple plausible assumption appears to work is remarkable and worth celebrating. And so the reason I say could and might is because I'm honest. And also because I haven't presumed the answer before I ask the question.
Let's go to some questions from you in the audience.
Hi, I'm Lorelai. So quick question for either side. What would change your mind to go to the reverse?
What would change your mind?
Yes.
How could the other guys convince you? I think,
right,
Lawrence,
what
you've
would
answered
have
that
to
a bunch of
Large
times.
cash deposit bank. Swiss bank under my name. $10 million.
The same thing that's caused me to change my mind
Lawrence
about
Krauss.
all the times I've been wrong, and I've been wrong many more times than Dinesh, I'm sure. A single shred of evidence. That's all.
Other side.
You know, I'm not even sure I could be persuaded unless we change the meaning of what science is.
That was a great question, by the way. Thanks a lot. On this side.
I live on the West Side, but I'm not from here, obviously. This is a question to Ian and Dinesh. Is there an observed phenomena for which the religious explanation has progressed ahead of the scientific explanation in terms of plausibility?
I'll answer that.
Dinesh D'Souza.
If you look at the Bible, it is not a science manual. It doesn't claim to make scientific proofs. In fact, what's interesting about the Bible is it doesn't make proofs at all. The Bible doesn't even attempt to prove God. It doesn't try to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. It asserts things. Why? Because for the most part, what the Bible is doing is it's in the province of revelation. Now, you'll notice that neither of us have ever in this debate appealed to the Bible to support any argument that we've made. We have argued on the basis of reason alone. Now, the Bible does make certain claims about the world and about man. So, for example, the Bible doesn't say that God made man out of nothing, but it does say that God made the universe out of nothing. It says that it made man out of some other stuff. Now, so the Bible says God created the world and God created man, but the Bible doesn't say how. So, that's where science comes in. Science can, and the scientific answer often changes, attempt to give explanations that actually don't refute the Bible. You could refute the Bible by showing that actually the universe has always existed and doesn't require any explanation whatsoever. You could show that God didn't make man out of the clay of the ground, but as Richard Dawkins said, aliens brought man from outer space. So you can actually refute propositions that are stated in the Bible.
Lawrence has had his head in his hand listening.
Well,
to
I
this
mean,
argument.
you don't really
Lawrence
want to.
Krauss.
You don't really want to go here, Dinesh. So I would say, for example, we refute the Bible by arguing that creating day and night before you create the sun is pretty silly.
Well, Lawrence, in that case, here's the problem. You have a fundamentalist reading of the Bible that is maybe subscribed to by 3% of Christians and 100% of atheists.
You just gave a fundamental. No, but you just. I'm sorry. Why I brought that up because I thought you were essentially repeating a fundamental assertion that somehow the Bible makes some scientific claims that are substantial, and the whole point is you don't want to go there because you and I know that a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible leads to nonsense. We both agree about that, right?
We both agree that there are fundamentalist factual claims that are so-called creation science that are nonsense. We agree on that.
So that case, the science refutes those claims.
Absolutely.
Okay. I did want to come back to and try to answer this question. And the import of that question was that theology as such has made no contribution to human knowledge or development. That's a claim that Lawrence has made in his book. Okay?
In the last 500 years or so.
So
yeah.
for the last 500 years. And I just want to make one comment on that. If you as an example, if you think about the Reformation probably brought about the biggest transformation of human learning and knowledge of the entire recorded history. And what caused the Reformation? Well, I guess Luther. Oh, what was Luther? A theologian.
And I can add to this. Right now, when we deal with war, all Western war is conducted according to the principles of the just war. That's why, for example, after 9/11, when America was bombing Taliban targets, we were dropping food to feed civilians on the enemy side. Now, where does the idea that you can kill combatants but not civilians come from? Did science teach us that? Nonsense. It comes straight out of Christianity, the principles of the just war that guide the knowledge of how we act today.
You will be our youngest ever questioner. There is no pressure on you whatsoever.
My name is David, and I'm a student at collegiate school, and I would like to know from the side for the motion, whether what your stance would be or what you would say to somebody that has had a spiritual experience.
Let's let Michael Shermer take that question.
Yeah, so we get this a lot. You know, how do you explain this or that? I think people's experiences are real, absolutely. I think most people don't just make up stories, although some do. Most people, when they experience, or they describe some miraculous, fantastic spiritual experience that they've had, they really mean it. Now, so the question is, what does it represent? Something out there in the world or something inside the brain? Well, we now know enough about neuroscience to know that the brain does generate a lot of these kind of spiritual experiences, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, sense presences, hallucinations, delusions. There's whole books about this, and so the experiences are real. What we want to know as scientists is, well, what do they actually represent? I mean, we know we can replicate these in the lab by doing certain things and causing people's brains to have these experiences. So most likely, the what's more likely question, that it's out there or that it's in here, the overwhelming evidence is that they're in here.
Good question. Ma'am, right there.
Do you believe that your Christianity is absolute and true? Or do you feel that you need to make a leap of faith there? And is a leap of faith scientific?
Well done.
So can I take this one, at least to begin with?
Ian Hutchinson.
Yes, I think faith is an important topic that we haven't touched on. And humans make decisions on the basis of incomplete evidence all the time during our lives. And it's people who act boldly and with determination and commitment who are the people who are, in the end, most successful in life. They act on the evidence that they have, even though that evidence is incomplete. And that is, as far as I can see, an explanation of what is, or at least part of what is meant by faith. Faith is that same principle of acting on the evidence we know, even though it's not complete, applied to matters of the spirit.
Lawrence Krauss.
That's good. As I said, in science we talk about likely and unlikely. In science, of course, and in life, we do, I agree, make decisions based on incomplete evidence. But the wonderful thing about science, the thing that makes science so much better than religion, is our faith is shakeable. I'm proud of the fact that there's something I can believe with all my heart to be absolutely true, and the minute there's a bit of evidence that shows it isn't true, I throw it out like yesterday's newspaper. In fact, that's the one thing I recommend, I hope every student has in their experiences sometime in their life, something that they profoundly believe in to be true, based on faith, shown to be wrong, because that opens their mind, and that's what science does that religion doesn't.
And that concludes round 2 of this Intelligence Squared US debate. On to round 3, closing statements. Our motion is Science Refutes God. And here to summarize his position against this motion, Ian Hutchinson, Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering at MIT.
Although it is incompetent to refute science, to refute God or religion, science is very important. It's our way of finding out about the regularities of the universe and this amazing natural world in which we live. And I think both sides can agree that we deplore the widespread ignorance of science. And if you share that viewpoint, then here's why you should vote against this motion. Claiming more for science than is warranted by its competence does not promote science, it damages it. It alienates intellectuals, particularly from other non-scientific disciplines, and so gives rise to the culture wars that have roiled the academy for the last few decades. People who make aggressive, anti-theistic claims on behalf of science are not acting as science's champions. They are bringing it into disrepute. They are confusing science with scientism, perhaps for their own polemic purposes. And they are, in the end, misrepresenting science to the public. And therefore, I urge you, whatever may be your religious beliefs, to vote against this erroneous motion.
Thank you, Ian Hutchinson. Our motion is Science Refutes God. And here to speak in support of the motion, Michael Shermer. He is the founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine and a columnist for Scientific American.
When I was a Christian and I matriculated at Pepperdine University, I was in what I call the bubble. I was in the bubble where everybody around you believes. And in that bubble, the Christian worldview, like any other worldview, is internally consistent, it's inherently logical, it's reinforced by everybody around you until you step outside of the bubble. What happened with me is I went to graduate school and I started to study social psychology, anthropology, psychology of beliefs, and so on. And there I realized that none of those arguments actually make sense in and of themselves, the arguments for God's existence. What it became clear to me is that what happens is you arrive at beliefs for non-rational, non-smart reasons, and then you back into it after the fact with rational reasons to justify it. We call this the confirmation bias. And so for me, I think there's overwhelming evidence that I've given you tonight that there's good anthropological, social science reasons why people believe in God that doesn't prove there's a God, but it proves that we create gods in our heads. In addition to that, I don't think there's any evidence to support that there actually is a God out there separate from our beliefs. So if you agree with me that the evidence points in that direction, that we constructed gods and not vice versa, I would urge you to vote on our side for the proposition that science refutes God.
Thank you, Michael Shermer. And that is our motion, Science Refutes God. And here to summarize his position against the motion, Dinesh D'Souza. He is the best-selling author of What's So Great About Christianity, and he is the director of 2016 Obama's America.
If science refutes God, you'd expect that one person who would know that would be Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin has supplied modern atheism with perhaps the strongest argument against God, evolution. And yet when Darwin published his evolution theory, the Harvard biologist, the American biologist Asa Gray wrote Darwin a letter in which he said, as a Christian, I was very inspired upon reading your book, because I have read in the book of Genesis that God made the world and God made man, but there's no information about how this might have occurred. And when I read your book, I understood not only why God made humans, but why there's so much suffering in the world. Evolution helps to account for the reason why there's suffering both for humans but also in the animal kingdom. Darwin was so thrilled at receiving this letter that he published it in future editions of The Origin of Species. According to Darwin's biographers, and there are many of them, Darwin lost his faith because he lost one of his daughters, Annie. It was the issue of suffering, not science, that turned Darwin against God. The scientific explanation doesn't refute the purposeful explanation. It coexists alongside it, and so it is with God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh D'Souza. Science Refutes God is our motion, and here to summarize his position in support of this motion, Lawrence Krauss. He is a theoretical physicist and director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University.
Human beings were clearly programmed by evolution to impute intentionality to the world around them. Meaning and purpose was infused in all everyday events to make sense of a dangerous, difficult, and uncaring world. So we had rituals behind the sun, the moon, the planets, the wind, the earth, the oceans, in all societies. The rise of our physical understanding has slowly caused us to do away with those many gods. We no longer have Mars, the god of war, Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, Thor, the god of storms. As scientists, we have to train ourselves to be skeptical of wanting to believe. And we should try and overcome our natural tendency to assume special significance to events. And human beings are also inevitably programmed to ask why, as we've heard it. But the why question is ill-posed, because it presumes purpose. It presumes the answer to the question before you ask the question. What if there is no purpose? Does there need to be purpose? And science tells us there's no evidence of purpose. So the why question is ill-posed. Our opponents want to keep the clock from ticking by avoiding the evidence of reality. And therefore, science, by telling us there's no need for purpose, has refuted the need for God, and that's why you should support our position.
Thank you, Lawrence Krauss. And that concludes our closing statements. Now it's time for you to judge which team has argued best. We're asking you again to go to the keypads at your seat that registered your vote as it did at the beginning, and we're going to get the readout almost instantaneously. As before, if you agree with the motion, push number 1. If you're against, push number 2. And if you're undecided or became undecided or remain undecided, push number 3. Okay, so it's all in. I have been given the results. Remember, the team that changes the most minds is declared the victor, and here it is. Before the debate, 37% agreed with the motion, 34% were against, and 29% were undecided. In the second vote, let's go first to the team that was arguing for the motion. Their number went from 37% to 50%. That's a 13% increase. So the team arguing against the motion has to do better than 13%. Let's see how they did. Before the vote, 34%. The second vote, 38%. That's up 4%. It's not enough. The team arguing for the motion, Science Refutes God, has won the debate. Our congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time. Join the debate online. Cast your vote, watch highlights, and learn more about Intelligence Squared US debates at pbs.org/Intelligence Squared. Funding for Intelligence Squared US is provided by the George L. Orstrom Jr. Foundation, Profit Capital, Paul E. Singer, the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, and others. A complete list is available from PBS.
Be more PBS.